This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. So you've probably had a fairly common experience. Say you're a parent with kids. I hear some couples disagree, so maybe, with your spouse or perhaps with a neighbor, friend, coworker. You've got a challenge. You got a relational squabble. You got something that you're having to discipline a kid for. And you walk through the issue at hand and kind of teasing out the underlying issues, what caused the conflict, and particularly if you're a parent disciplining a child, you may not do this in front of them, but you have this moment where you walk away from the scene and you reflect on what's happened and you say to yourself, I'm kind of like that too. You ever had that experience? The thing that frustrates you about somebody else, with a little bit of reflection and introspection, you say, you know what? They're playing out some patterns that are more like me than I care to admit. Maybe the child twisted the truth to deceive, and you notice that you too tend to minimize your shortcomings to make yourself look better to other people. Or maybe they got embarrassed and they lashed out in anger, and you also tend to unravel when things don't go your way. We're all more alike than we are different, after all. My hope is that a similar thing happens to you as we consider our passage this morning. We've got a long text. We're going to try to do 2 Samuel 13 and 14, 2 chapters, and it's an odd passage. And what I'm hoping the outcome will be is that rather than some kind of intellectual curiosity, you're able to step into the story and say, you know what, I kind of see myself there. I can kind of place myself in this story. And since we've got a really long passage and we've got a really odd passage, I'm going to go just back to the basics of good Bible reading and good sermon delivery, I hope, this morning. No creativity whatsoever in my outline or my defining questions for us this morning. We're going to look at 3 questions. What happened? Second question, why did it happen? And third question, what can we learn from what happened? Okay, so just real simple. This is the ABCs of Bible reading. What happened? Why did it happen? So try to get a little bit of diagnostic work here. Why did it happen? And then what can we learn from what happened? Because we've got such a long text, we'll spend a bulk of time on this question of what happened. So hopefully you've got your Bibles open. We're not going to be able to read each of these passages, so I'm going to point you to some verses and hope that you'll note this as we go. Picking up in chapter 13, verse 1, we have to be careful with something right at the outset. Just want to notice as a caveat. Chapters 13 and 14 are a bit of a prologue for us of what's going to come in chapters 15 to 19. If this were a Marvel movie, this would be a bit of an origin story for us on what's happening with these cast of characters that we're going to meet in chapters 15 and following. And for that reason, because it's a prologue to a coming attraction, we're going to want this passage to do more than it's designed to do. We're going to want it to answer questions that it simply does not answer. We're going to want resolution that does not come from this story. And we've got to kind of place it in its text as a bit of a preface, as a bit of an origin story for the kings that are going to be in play in the coming 4 chapters. Sometime past, verse 1, David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister named Tamar. David's son Amnon was infatuated with her. All right, let's pause in verse 1. And don't worry, I'm not going to take this long on every verse. It'd be impossible. Notice, I want to point out a few things. Notice we're just given a timestamp at the start that says sometime later. We don't know how long's passed since the scene's at play. Indication is probably a season, but it could be longer. We could have years that have passed between the David and Bathsheba episode, all that comes and transpires with Nathan. We're not really told. There's a season of change. And we're introduced to some characters. I think, at least in my own Bible reading, this is a place in the Old Testament where I start to unravel, because generally the story up to this point has followed one main actor, one main story, and we start to see the splintering of the nation even beginning to happen here, and certainly in chapters 15 and following. And so we're going to have like 5 or 6 different characters doing things all at the same time. And if you're not careful, you can just get really frustrated and give up as things start to splinter and unravel. The implications of David's sin lead to this splintering, and it can be really difficult because we don't know these names and places to keep the characters. So let me help you a bit with just doing some character placement for us. If you're drawing even kids, this would be a really good place. You could kind of trace a family tree even here to keep these people in play. So first up, we've got David. He's the central character of this story. And David has the Bible tells us at least 8 wives in the story, Bathsheba being the last of those. And that, again, originally presents a challenge for us. We are, as we read the Bible's text here, we're describing something that's happening. We're not prescribing. So polygamy is not God's plan. It's not his intention, but rather it's a worldly pattern that David embraces, and we'll certainly see under him here, and certainly under Solomon. But this is going to lead to all sorts of chaos. Okay, so David has at least 8 wives, and we're introduced to some of the kids in the narrative, but not all of them. Let's work in kind of reverse order. Amnon, whom Patrick just read about, is David's firstborn son. David's firstborn son. But he's his firstborn son to his second wife. So there's some girls that precede his birth. He's the firstborn, and as the firstborn, he's the presumptive heir to the throne. Okay? So if you're kind of drawing family tree, second wife, first kid, first son, Amnon, he's the presumptive heir to the throne. Again, kind of origin story. This is going to be the guy that we're going to think he's going to inherit the promises that God made to David back in the past. So Amnon would be the classic one. Then we've got Absalom. He is the third son born to David, and as such, he's kind of a missable kid. He's the third son born to David and his third wife. Okay, again, I know it's super confusing, but I'm trying to, donuts on the bottom shelf, okay? Third son born, third to the third wife. He's a missable kid, third kid, not the presumptive heir, but as we're going to see, he's distinctive, he's super handsome, he's the one that if you were kind of picking out of a lineup, it would be this one that you would choose to be the king. So again, origin story, we're going to see the two that seem the one that's qualified to be the heir, and the one that looks like the heir are going to vie for David's throne in the story that comes. And then we've got Tamar. Okay, she is listed as Absalom's sister, and as the family tree that I just drew, she would be Amnon's half-sister here. So Absalom's sister, born to the third wife, Amnon's half-sister. And then Jonadab, who shows up in the story, is Amnon's cousin or David's nephew here in the story. Now, lurking behind all of this is the one who was not mentioned, the one who showed up in our story last week, and that's Solomon. Remember, Solomon then is going to be way down the list here. He's going to be born to David's 8th wife, Bathsheba. He's not going to be the firstborn to this one. So lurking behind this story is there are 2 people that are qualified for the throne. They're going to vie for that throne. And then there's going to be the one that God's actually going to raise up for the throne that's kind of lurking in the backstory. So we're going to learn, how did all this play out? What happened among this cast of characters to disqualify them, as it were? Let's answer the first question, what happened, by isolating 3 scenes in the story. If you're in your worship guide, you kind of draw a line of division there in the text between verses 20 and 21. So all that precedes that in chapter 13 is going to be scene 1. 21 to the end of chapter 13 is going to be scene 2, and then all of chapter 14 is going to be scene 3. Let's survey what happens in the text. Verse 2 of chapter 13. Amnon was frustrated. Remember, he's infatuated with his half-sister here, to the point of making himself sick over his sister Tamar, because she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to do anything to her. So he's infatuated, he wants her. And Jonadab, he's presented in the text, again, this is cousin relationship. He's presented as wise, but the language here is like shrewd. He's cunning, he's crafty. So he devises a scene. Here's what he says. He goes to his cousin and says, you seem miserable. What's wrong? What's going on? Amnon says, I want someone I can't have. Likely, the can't have here is derived from, there's a relational tension here. This is my sister, and there's probably guards, there's probably living quarters that are separating them. So even if he wanted to, he couldn't bring her to himself. So the cousin concocts a plan. Just lay down, pretend to be sick. When your father comes to check on you, say, I don't want you to bring me food, I want her to bring me food. Get her to prepare something for me, bring her close. And then, and it's clear from the reading of the text, he's concocting, he has his outcome in mind. So David does just that. He's a pawn in the scheme. He asks Tamar, his daughter, to go and make her brother some food. And then the text that we just read, verses 8 to 14. Amnon rapes his sister. The text, look in verse 13. Our English translation, there's some exclamatory sense here. If you do this, you're going to be like one of the outrageous fools. Perhaps a better translation here is godless perverts. This gives us some sense of the severity of what's happened. If we do this, you're going to be like one of those godless perverts in Israel. We don't do this. We don't rape. We don't commit incest. And there's disagreement in the commentaries. Are we to the point where Israel has these laws that would bar this type of incestual relationship? I think all that's kind of ridiculous, honestly. By this point, it's clear that he knows this is wrong, that he knows this is rape. And I think the text insinuates, at least on 4 occasions, that it's more than just rape. He knows it's his sister. So the relationship is out of bounds on multiple levels. And then he makes matters worse. He's not only a godless pervert, but he turns soon after the act and he throws her out. The text, look in verse 15. It's stronger than it is in our English translations. It's simply up and out are the words that are used there. In English, we supply some words to make the text read better. He just simply says, up and out. And then look in verse 17. Get this away from me. And that's the literal translation of that text. Your CSB does a good job here. He doesn't even give her a gender. He certainly doesn't give her a name. She's just a commodity to discharge. Get this thing away from me. He discards her. He lays her to waste on multiple levels, and she's left desolate. And we are meant to grieve, to feel sympathy for Tamar. She is trapped, verses 5 to 11. She's ignored, verses 14 and 16. She's raped, verse 14. She's despised, verse 15. She's banished, verse 17. And then by her own account, she is ruined in verse 18. He leaves her destroyed. So Absalom finds out what happens, and he knows. The text tells us that he doesn't even have to be told. He knows what his brother has done. And he takes her into his house to care for her. All right, cut. End of scene 1. Again, we're just what happened. Okay, this is what happened, scene 1. Scene 2 turns in verse 21. David learns about what happens as the text begins. And he feels angry, verse 21, but he's inactive. And this is a pattern for us in David. He feels something, but he doesn't act on it. He doesn't do what is right. He should have done something to punish Amnon and to give care for Tamar. My instinct is perhaps there's some lingering shame over what he's done with Bathsheba that is still haunting his mind as he interacts with this story. But it's enough to stop him from acting when he should. Absalom is presented as the actor here. He doesn't speak one way or another, but look in verse 22. We're told that he hated Amnon. Now, perhaps hovering behind this hatred is not merely the act, but the fact that these two are the presumptive vyers for the throne. Most would surmise that there had been some tension in this brotherly relationship already, so it gets accentuated when he's raped his sister. But the text tells us very clearly that his hatred is since, verse 22, since he disgraced his sister Tamar. So 2 years pass. Absalom has some sheep shearers out in the fields, and this would have been an occasion for a family party. You don't hire these to come and work and deal with one person, but you get a whole group together, and the people that have the sheep, they would drink and feast, and there would be a celebration while all of this is happening. So he asked for everyone else to come, and especially his brother Amnon. No one's doing anything. It seems that Amnon is getting away with what he does. And so Absalom, verse 28, takes matters into his own hands. Now Absalom, I'm reading verse 28, commanded his young men, watch Amnon until he's in a good mood with the wine. When I order you to strike Amnon, then kill him. Don't be afraid. I'm not the one who has commanded you am I not the one who has commanded you be strong and valiant? If you're familiar with the scriptures, notice the familiarity with that, and the way that Joshua begins with the command to Israel to be strong and courageous. Be strong and valiant to do this misdeed. So Absalom's young men did to Amnon just as Absalom had commanded them. Then all the rest of the king's sons got up, and each fled to his own mule. The latter half of the chapter, David gets word that his sons have been killed. He assumes all of them have been destroyed in Job-like fashion, but not so fast. It's not all the sons, it's just one. Verse 32, my Lord must not think that they've killed all the young men, the king's sons, because only Amnon is dead. In fact, Absalom has planned this ever since the day that Amnon disgraced his sister Tamar. So now, my Lord the king, don't take seriously the report that says all of your sons are dead. Only Amnon is dead. So Absalom ends the chapter fleeing to his maternal grandmother's house. He doesn't return, maternal grandfather's house. He doesn't return to his father on that day. So it appears at the end of chapter 13, David's lost two sons. Amnon to murder, Absalom to a desolate life living in isolation. Cut. Scene 2. Last scene, scene 3. It begins kind of with an introduction in verse 38. After Absalom had fled, he was there for 3 years. King David longed to go to Absalom, for David had finished grieving over Amnon's death. Now look in 14:1. The English reads, the king's mind was on Absalom. I think that's a good translation in the CSB. The text can make it appear like he was longing for restoration here, but the passage doesn't actually tell us that. Therefore, there's disagreement. Was he wanting to get even and avenge what was happening? Was he simply longing to seek justice? Was he longing for some form of restoration? We're not told, but we do know that he's constantly thinking about this one who's out there, his son who's out in a far country, as it were. David needs a little nudge. So Joab, whose family lineage isn't really important, he's a military commander under David at this point, and he's related to him in some fashion. He sees that the king is burdened, so much like the cousin in chapter 13, he concocts a plan. He solicits a woman to go and say to David, she tells him, let's actually read in verse 5 of chapter 14, what's the matter? The king asks her. Notice the overtones to what happened in the chapter before. You've got somebody coming, seeing somebody that's upset and saying, what's the matter? And then really concocting just a weird story. Sadly, I'm a widow. My husband dies. She said, my husband has died. She said, your servant had 2 sons. They were fighting in the field with no one to separate them. One struck the other and killed him. The whole clan has risen up against your servant, said, hand over the one who killed his brother so that we may put him to death for the life of the brother he murdered. We will eliminate their heir. They would extinguish my one remaining ember by not preserving my husband's name or posterity on the earth. The king said to the woman, go home, I will issue a command on your behalf. And the woman of Tekoa said to the king, my lord the king, may any blame be on me and my father's family, and may the king and his throne be innocent. Whoever speaks to you, the king said, bring him to me. He will not trouble you again. She replied, please, may the king invoke the Lord your God so that the avenger of blood will not increase the loss, and they will not eliminate my son. As the Lord lives, he said, not a hair on your son's head will fall to the ground. So we have a concocted story of 2 sons, one who murders the other, and he's out, and he should be judged for the crime that he's committed. And David says, no, I'm going to preserve the lineage here. I'm going to bring him back. And she's like, well, Mom, what happens? Because there are going to be people out to seek justice and destroy him. He says, I'm going to take care of this. I'm going to make sure that he's restored to you and brought back into right relationship. And then at the end, verse 12 and following, this is kind of like another Nathan. Do you remember that scene? Like, you are the man. Okay, this is how this story plays out. Hey, king, this is you. The lady calls all this wisdom of David and says, you're not demonstrating wisdom in your inaction here. You've decreed this make-believe woman's banished son to be restored, but you're doing nothing to restore your own son. You've not brought back your own banished son, and now he's destined to die. David interprets what's at play here and says, somebody put you up to this, woman. You would never know. You can't do this to me. You can't turn the script on me. Who put you up? Did Joab put you up to this? She says, yes, Joab gave me the words to say. So the king tells Joab, go and bring my son back. This is interesting. He can live in my house but not see my face. Bring him back close but not too close. Let's assuage my conscience here, but we're not going to restore right relationship. And Absalom comes back, and he's a looker. We're told he's got 5 pounds of hair on his head, which, man, I'm envious of. This is an odd way to describe the dude, for sure. He's a fan favorite, so people are vying to get him back in the game. Here's the presumptive heir to the throne now. Amnon's gone. And we read, verse 28, Absalom resided in Jerusalem 2 years, but he never saw the king. Then Absalom sent for Joab in order to send him to the king. But Joab was unwilling to come to him. So he sent him again, second time. He still wouldn't come. Absalom said to his servant, see, Joab has a field right next to mine. He's got some barley there. Go set fire to it. So Absalom's servants set fire on the field. So now I've got your attention, right? Now you're surely going to come now because it just burnt your field. So come to me, and when you come, I'm going to tell you, I want you to send me to the king. Kind of read between the lines. I'm going to burn something else down. If he wants to kill me, he'll kill me. So Joab told the king, verse 33, Joab went to the king and told him, apparently Joab has David's ear in a way that Absalom can't at this point. So David summoned Absalom, who came to the king and paid homage with his face to the ground before him. And then the king kissed Absalom. Ill-advised move. We're going to learn in chapter 15 and following. The king brings this scoundrel close, and it's going to cost him. We want the last verse here to end with this promising note of restoration, akin to the prodigal father whose son comes back home and they throw a party. But this is a place we're asking the text to do more than it actually does. We're not told of this joyous restoration, this right relationship back in play, but we're introduced with tension. One who's been a scoundrel for an extended period of time, who's taken matters into his own hands to get his way, who's now brought back in proximity to the king. And we're going to see Absalom's subversive activities continue and grow in consequence. But this is the cut of scene 3. From the timestamps of the narrative, we've traveled about a decade in these 2 chapters. A decade of time in 3 scenes, and to be honest, they are anticlimactic. The end is even a bit of a cliffhanger. If we're left with that alone, perhaps we could preach a joyous sermon about restoration, but that's not what happens. There's some level of restoration and a kiss from the king, but we're not told exactly what form, and because of what we'll learn next week, it's actually going to turn more negative than positive. And perhaps even worse in these 2 chapters, as with the Bathsheba episode, we're given no resolution for what happened to Tamar. There's no resolution in the text other than more sin. We're simply told that she lived an isolated life. She suffered, she continued to suffer throughout her life. So we've got a decade of rape, incest, murder, fiery fields, and broken relationships. It is a long line of sinners and sufferers. Surely the Lord was right in 2 Samuel 12:10 when he pictured what would come. Now therefore, The sword will never leave your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own wife. Even in chaos, chapters 13 and 14, God is keeping his promises, isn't he? Now, let's go a layer. Second question, why did this happen? Why did it happen? So we got what happens. We got three scenes of kind of increasing levels of complexity and chaos. But why? And this is where I want to meddle a little bit with us. There's a way to answer the question that's akin to what we answered last week, just like because God said so, with why the child died. I mean, it's true, right? That this certainly happens because Absalom, Amnon, and others are following in a pattern set by Adam. Certainly, brother killing brother isn't a new story in the Bible, is it? We're seeing a repeat performance of the Cain and Abel narrative from many centuries before. They are fallen people doing fallen people things. That's not super instructive for us. Not a lot of practical guidance there. Attempt to answer on two levels why this happened that perhaps gets us into this passage. First, David's sons amplify David's sin patterns. Why does this happen? David's sons amplify their father's sin patterns. Little commentary here. We'll dabble in it more in just a minute. Chapters 11 and 12. David is using his time to play with sin rather than to fight God's battles. Lustful glance leads to an affair. Fear of consequences lead to lying and murdering. And he doesn't own his sin until somebody steps up like Nathan and calls him to account. And now we see, and I think the language is right here, we see an amplification of those sin patterns, don't we, in chapters 13 and 14. Lustful glances and an impulsive affair become extended sexual perversion, plotting and scheming in order to rape and commit incest. Fear moves from deceptively putting a man on the front line and passively aggressively manufacturing his death to now taking matters into your own hands and killing a brother. Under David, he owns what he did, at least to some level, in taking Bathsheba into his house and providing for her as a husband. Here, this one is cast up and out. She's left desolate, unlike Bathsheba, with no one to care. She's simply kicked to the curb. The snowball of sin in chapters 13 and 14 grows in both speed and size generationally. It grows in both speed and size generationally. Second answer. So first, David's sons amplify David's sin patterns. David's sons embrace sin's pattern. They amplify David's sin patterns broadly, and then they embrace a very common pattern of sin as a whole. And I think this pattern is really super instructive for us. But you notice the progression that plays out in each of these three stories. What I want. I want to have Tamar, and I'm frustrated because I can't get what I want. I want to avenge Tamar's rape. I want to make things right. I want to get even. I hate my brother. I want to bring about restoration with the king. I want to get back close to David. What I want, when I want it. I can't have her, so I'll get her now. Nothing's happening to my brother. He's seemingly living out after this sin pattern, so I'll take matters into my own hands to resolve it, to avenge Tamar's rape. I'll kill him. The king's doing nothing. Everybody's inactive here. I'm living in his house, but I can't even get his ear, so I'm just going to set fire to a field. Surely somebody will pay attention then. What I want, when I want it, how I want it. I can't have her or somebody like her as my wife, so I will force myself on her. I can't trust God to resolve Amnon's sin, so I'll just kill him. I can't live with the relational tension of being in the house but not in right relationship. So I'll talk somebody else into getting his ear. What I want, when I want it, and how I want it. And what happens when we embrace this pattern of sin? Look in verse 15. This is the verse that Patrick left off with in chapter 13. Doesn't this verse tell an all too familiar story of the outcome of sin's pattern? Amnon hated Tamar with such intensity that the hatred that he hated her with was greater than the love that he loved her with. So he said, get out. The gratification of sinful instincts comes up short, as it always does. What I want, when I want it, how I want it, falls flat every time. So what can we learn? What happened? Why did it happen? I think two main ideas from this passage. David's sons are amplifying his sin patterns, and David's sons are following in sin's pattern, the pattern of sin throughout history. So what can we learn as Christ Fellowship this morning? There's a temptation in reading this story to read yourself right out of it. By that I mean, perhaps to say, hey, I've not raped, I've not committed incest, I've not devised a murder or set fire to my neighbor's house. So at least the thought goes, there's not much for me to learn here, right? Other than kind of the moralistic, don't do that, right? Which is an overly simplified sermon. Just don't do that. That's not what we want to angle towards. Or perhaps some of you have not been on the receiving end of violence like what's described in this story. So the question is there anything in the text for us? I think there's more here than we care to admit. And I want to try to limit my applications to the two ways we answered question 2. Why did this happen? David's sons amplifying David's sin patterns, David's sons following in sin's pattern. So let's apply a point of application for us to each of those. Idea number 1. We should own our influences while looking to Jesus to break sin's progression. We should own our influences while looking to Jesus to break sin's progression. What do I mean? We commented that David's sons are stepping into the family line here. They're stepping into a pattern that their father was living out and that they have amplified. And in a very similar way, friends, we have upstream influences that shape us, often in ways we fail to understand and appreciate. Now, I'm not saying that universally. Some of you feel them very concrete. But for many of us, those influences are a bit more mundane. And downstream, our lives are leaving generational impact on those who come after us, shaping them in ways that we probably underestimate and underappreciate at the moment. So we need to grapple with what influences are shaping me upstream and what am I shaping downstream. Perhaps those ladies in the room, most specifically, who've suffered like Bathsheba and Tamar can amen this reality most readily. Many in our congregation and in other congregations across the world are moving through life carrying the weight of sin that has been committed against them. They know full well how destructive sin's consequences can be. But they're not the only ones that carry the weight of other sins. Perhaps you, the passivity of a father, leads you, man, to hide in the shadows rather than stepping up and leading. Perhaps the materialism of your family of origin leads you to care far too much about keeping up with the Joneses. Perhaps in our congregation, the religious legalism and hypocrisy that you saw in your home growing up or among those that you schooled with marred your upbringing and made it tough for you to be honest and vulnerable with other people. The list, friends, is unending. And were it not for Jesus, this would be hopeless. It would be hopeless. If the cascading impact of sin always got worse and worse from one generation to the next, we would be left with little hope. But the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ is both. Jesus provides a way to change the ultimate consequences of your sin, to be forgiven, and, as the great song suggests, provides the power to break the power of canceled sin in this life. Both in the life to come, forgiveness for sin, and in this life, the good news of Jesus Christ gives you the ability to break the power of canceled sin, both sin that you have committed and sin that's been committed against you. Christian, if you are truly in Christ, your identity is not primarily that you are a passive victim of sin that's been committed against you, nor are you defined by the sins that you have committed. Rather, you are a beloved child of God, indwelt with His Spirit, and given an eternal inheritance among the saints. And, as Paul will write in Romans 8, if by the Spirit you can put to death the deeds of the body, and if you do, you will live. Both the Bathshebas and Tamars and the Absaloms, Amnons, and the like need this kind of hope. In this life, we can neither avenge for the sin that's been done to us or break free from the sin that we commit in our flesh alone. But by the power of the Spirit of God, you who have suffered for the sins of others and you who have perpetuated violence against others can live in freedom by the power of the Spirit of the living God. Even if in this life restoration and reconciliation does not come. Secondly, we should strive to die to what I want, when I want, how I want it. We should strive to die to what I want, when I want, how I want it. Now, just a little caveat here. I'm not advocating for some type of stoic monasticism here, okay? I'm not arguing for a joyless life of self-flagellation and pain. But I am suggesting, friends, that the same evil desires that lead to rape and incest and murder are often lurking just under the veneer of the life that you perpetuate to others. Remember how we started. We find much more about ourselves in these stories than we care to admit. After all, how often are you prone to what I want, when I want, how I want it? If we had more time, I could make a compelling argument that what I want, when I want, how I want it is actually the operating mantra of our society. Many people would shorten this down to just the term consumerism. Basically means all of life is viewed through the lens of a consumer. How I meet my needs, I'm going to meet them as quickly and easily as possible. From ordering a book to picking a church, consumerism makes the world go round. Sadly, however, the Bible says that this is actually a mark of the godless and not a mark of followers of Jesus. Consistently, the Bible is going to speak of what I want, when I want, how I want it as a pattern of life actually apart from God. I'll consider two, Titus 3. You two were once foolish, disobedient, deceived, and then enslaved by various passions and pleasures, living in malice, envy, hatred, detesting one another. Philippians 3, this is a classic verse making this point. So I once told you, and now say again with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Notice how Paul's going to define enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is destruction. Their God is their stomach. Their glory is in their shame. They are focused on earthly things. What a convicting phrase. Living with my God as my stomach is a mark of godlessness. Friends, if we gorge on our appetites, living with our stomach as our own God, you will be obese. And much like physical obesity, it will crush your heart. You cannot live that way. It is a complete anti-God state of mind. This works on both ends. Both those suffering at the hand of the sin of others. Friends, as difficult as it is, you can't be ruled by your passion to get justice for the harm that's been done to you. Festering wounds of bitterness will crush you. Getting even will not satisfy. And those sinning against others, actively or passively, being dominated by your passions will crush you. Notice how Paul writes, the end is destruction of these patterns. So what is our hope? Our hope is turning our affections from being ruled by the God of our stomach to being ruled by the God of the universe. The God of the universe who, when he came in flesh, was loving, self-giving, kind, bent on living for others and not for himself. When tempted, he, Christ, was able to defer gratification and entrust himself to the will of the Father. And so I will either be ruled today by my stomach or ruled today by the rightful Lord of all. Those who live through the Spirit, empowered by the Spirit, can live this better way. We can die to patterns of self-gratification that only lead to self-hate, either in the form of bitterness or in the form of consumption. So it's worth asking in our time of reflection, what pattern does my life demonstrate? Am I in the line of David's sons here, or in the line of the Son of God? Whose line am I in? And it presses us in little ways and really, really big ways. When given a chance, I should actively war against or vie to break the pattern of what I want, when I want, how I want it. I think this is one of the reasons that the most often neglected spiritual discipline in the American church is fasting, because fasting is functionally breaking this pattern. It's doing something that's breaking what I want, when I want, how I want it. And if you don't want to step into this story, you gotta learn to arrest that pattern. What I want, when I want. So in our time of reflection before we stand to sing, how is the Spirit of the living God pressing you to call sin to mind of consumerism, to call sin to mind this pattern that's playing out in your life? Give you some space to reflect, some space to confess, and some space to thank the Lord that you who are in Christ, this does not have to be the final outcome. You don't have to live being ruled by your God as your stomach. Let's take 2 minutes of kind of private, personal reflection, and then we'll stand to sing. God, we thank you that you are a better God than our stomachs. We thank you that we see both in our lives and in the story of Scripture the end result of being enslaved to our appetites. And whether that is the appetite for vengeance, the appetite to rewrite the script of harm that's been done to us, or the appetite to feast on our lust or our anger or our perversion. God, we thank you that the Bible does not mince words about where all that moves. And we thank you that you, through Christ and the power of the Spirit, give us the means of arresting that pattern. We can stop it. We thank you that the patterns that have been in play in our lives, that the work of Jesus Christ offers forgiveness and offers the power to break that pattern. And we ask that by your Spirit, you would help us to live in these really hard stories of the Old Testament, such that we would live in freedom that comes through the Spirit of the living God. As we sing, we pray that you would increase our affections for the true and right God and increase our disdain for our appetites. We ask that in Christ's name.